Vethra's station smelled like rust and old fear, and the kind of sweat that comes from people who have stopped hopping for anything better than tomorrow. Cale Marin walked through the lower corridors with his hands in his jacket pockets and his eyes on the floor because that was how you survived places like this. You kept your head down and you did your job and you left before the trouble found you. He was a tall man with a scar that ran from his left temple down to his jaw and eyes that looked like they had seen something a long time ago that they could never unsee. Which was exactly true, because 3 years ago on a burning colony world called Cygnus, he had disobeyed a direct order to retreat and had instead turned his ship around to evacuate 400 civilians that command had decided were acceptable losses. They gave him a dishonorable discharge for that, and he had worn it like a medal ever since. Now he ran a small armed freighter called the Defiance with a crew of 4 people who were all broken in their own ways, and all loyal in ways that mattered more than rank or regulation. And today, all he wanted was to pick up a cargo container of medical supplies and get paid and get gone. But the universe had other plans for Cale Marin. The station was busier than usual, and there were Valkyrie everywhere, tall and pale and beautiful in the way that a blade is beautiful, with their silver armor and their cold, ancient eyes that looked at every other species the way a man looks at furniture. The Valkyrie Empire was the oldest power in the known galaxy, and they had been conquering worlds since before humanity had learned to make fire. And they had a very simple philosophy about the universe, which was that some species were born to rule, and every other species was born to serve. And if you disagreed with that philosophy, they would burn your world to glass and move on without a second thought. Cale hated them the way you hate a thunderstorm, not because it was personal, but because it was dangerous and everywhere, and there was nothing you could do about it. He was cutting through the market level when he heard the noise. A low murmur of voices coming from behind a set of heavy doors that were guarded by 2 Valkyrie soldiers in full combat gear. He knew what was behind those doors because he had heard the rumors on the docking level. The Valkyrie were holding what they called a cultural exchange, which was their polite way of saying they were selling living beings to the highest bidder. He should have walked past. Every survival instinct he had told him to walk past. But something pulled at him the way a hook pulls at a fish, and before he knew it, he was slipping through a side entrance into the viewing gallery above the auction floor. The room below was large and cold and lit with pale blue light, and on a raised platform in the center stood 12 figures, small and slender with skin that glowed faintly like moonlight on water and large dark eyes that seemed to hold entire oceans of sadness. They were Valith, one of the rarest species in the galaxy, natural empaths who could feel the emotions of every living being around them. And they were the most valuable slaves the Valkyrie possessed, because they could read truth from lies and pain from pleasure and loyalty from betrayal with a single touch. Every one of them wore a metal collar around their throat, and Cale had heard what those collars did. They sent a constant pulse of low-level pain through the nervous system to keep the empathic abilities dampened and the wearer compliant. And they had been wearing them since childhood. Most of the Valith on the platform were glassy-eyed and hollow and gone, broken so thoroughly that there was nothing left behind their beautiful luminous faces except silence. But one of them was not broken. She was young, maybe 14 in human equivalent years, and she was trembling from head to toe, and her skin was flickering with light the way a candle flickers in a draft. But her eyes were open and alive, and burning with something that Cale recognized instantly, because he had seen it in his own mirror every day for 3 years. It was the look of someone who was terrified, but had not yet given up. A Valkyrie handler grabbed her arm and pulled her forward to the edge of the platform, and a buyer, some fat merchant from a species Cale did not recognize, leaned in close, and examined her the way you would examine a piece of equipment, and the girl flinched and the handler hit her across the back of the head, and said something sharp in Valkyrie that Cale did not need to translate, because cruelty sounds the same in every language. And the girl looked up. She looked up through the crowd and through the gallery, and her eyes found Kale, found him like a compass finds north. And she did not beg, and she did not cry, and she did not mouth the word help. She just looked at him. And he felt something crack open inside his chest, like a door that had been locked for a very long time. He looked at her, this child who had never known a day without pain. And then he looked at them, at the handlers and the buyers and the guards and the Valkyrie Archon named Driven Salkith, who sat on a throne-like chair at the far end of the room with his legs crossed and his fingers steepled, and an expression of absolute boredom on his perfect silver face, as if the selling of children was so routine that it could not even hold his attention. And something old and heavy and human settled into Kale Marin's bones. It was not rage. Rage is hot and fast and burns itself out. This was something deeper and colder and more dangerous. This was the quiet, terrible certainty of a man who has found the line he cannot cross and has realized that everything he does from this moment forward will be measured by what he does right now. He turned away from the gallery. He walked back through the corridors of Vethra Station, and his face was different now. His crew would later say it was like watching a light come on behind bulletproof glass, calm on the surface and burning underneath. He reached the Defiance in 12 minutes and walked up the boarding ramp and into the cockpit where Rena Voss was sitting with her boots on the console, eating dried fruit and complaining about the station's docking fees. She looked at his face and stopped chewing. She had known Kale for 2 years, and she had seen him angry, and she had seen him sad, and she had seen him drunk and laughing at 3 in the morning. But she had never seen this expression before, and it scared her more than any of those other things. She said, "Kale, what happened?" He did not answer right away. He stood there for a moment looking at nothing, and then he said, "Get Terk and dock to the bridge." "Why?" "Because we are going to do something stupid." Rena put her boots on the floor and said, "How stupid?" And Kale Marin looked at her with those eyes that had seen Cygnus burn and said, "The kind of stupid that starts wars." In the cargo hold below them, the medical supplies sat in their crate waiting to be delivered, waiting for the simple, safe legal job that would have kept them all alive and anonymous and free. They would never be delivered. Because somewhere on a platform in a cold blue room, a girl with moonlight skin had looked at a stranger, and the stranger had looked back, and in that single moment of connection, something had begun that could not be stopped. A chain of events that would stretch across star systems and decades, and would end with the greatest empire the galaxy had ever known lying in ashes. But that was later. Right now there was just a man on a ship with fire in his chest, and a crew that trusted him, and a plan that did not exist yet. And 12 children who were running out of time. The plan came together in 4 hours, and it was held together by duct tape and desperation, and the kind of wild stubbornness that only humans seem to possess. Kale stood at the table in the Defiance's small war room, which was really just the kitchen with the food pushed aside, and laid it out for his crew while they stared at him like he had lost his mind. There were 4 of them, and he needed every single one. Rena Voss was the pilot, a woman with red hair and a mouth that moved faster than her brain and hands that could fly anything with an engine. She had been kicked out of 3 flight academies for reckless behavior before Kale found her running illegal cargo races in the asteroid belts of Tau Ceti. Terk Dunn was the muscle, a former Marine built like a wall of stone and silence who had a daughter named Lily back on Earth that he had not seen in 3 years, because he could not stop doing the kind of work that kept him away from her. He was the gentlest violent man Kale had ever known. Doc Hersch Ackefer was the medic, a xenobiologist who had spent 10 years in academia writing papers about alien suffering B. For one day he put down his pen and said, "I am done writing about pain," and walked out and never went back. He was the conscience of the ship and everyone knew it. And Juno was the ship's AI, a semi-autonomous intelligence who lived in the Defiance's systems and spoke with the dry sarcasm of someone who had calculated the odds of survival and decided to stay anyway. Kale told them what he had seen and what he wanted to do, and when he was finished, the room was quiet for a long time. Rena spoke first because Rena always spoke first. She said, "You want to steal 12 empathic children from the most powerful empire in the galaxy." "Yes." "From a station that has over 200 Valkyrie soldiers on it." "Yes." "With the 5 of us." "Yes." "And you understand that if we do this, they will hunt us until we are dead." "Yes." Rena looked at Terk, and Terk looked at Doc, and Doc looked at his hands, and then back at Kale, and said, "Tell me about the collars." Kale told him, and he watched Doc's face change, watched the gentle academic disappear, and something harder take its place. And when Kale finished, Doc said very quietly, "They designed these to hurt children." It was not a question. It was the sound of a man choosing a side. Terk said nothing for a long time, and then he pulled out his communicator and looked at a photograph on the screen, a little girl with dark eyes and a gap-toothed smile. And he put it away and said, "What do you need me to do?" Juno's voice came through the speakers calm and measured as always. "I have calculated our probability of success at 11%, and our probability of dying horribly at 63%. Shall I continue with the breakdown, or would you prefer to maintain your irrational optimism?" Kale almost smiled. "Maintain the optimism." "Very well, I will begin scanning the station's power grid for vulnerabilities, because apparently we are doing this." The plan was simple, because simple was all they had. Juno would trigger a cascading systems failure in the station's docking ring, a chain reaction of blown relays and venting coolant that would create enough chaos to pull the guards away from the holding area for approximately 9 minutes. 9 minutes, that was all they would have. Rena would keep the Defiance hot and ready in the docking bay with the engines running and the cargo ramp down. Terk would clear the corridor between the holding area and the ship, by force if necessary, and it would absolutely be necessary. Kale and Doc would enter the holding area and remove the suppression collars from the 12 Valith and lead them to the ship. It was the collars that worried Doc the most. He spent 3 hours studying black market schematics that Kale bought from an information broker for an amount of money that made Rena physically ill, and what he found made him go pale. The collars were not simple restraints. They were neural interfaces wired directly into the brainstem, and removing them incorrectly would kill the wearer instantly. And removing them correctly required a specific electromagnetic pulse delivered at exactly the right frequency for exactly the right duration. Doc built the device himself from parts he pulled out of the Defiance's medical bay, and when Kale asked him if it would work, Doc said, "Probably." And Kale said, "Probably is good enough." And Doc said, "It really is not, but I appreciate your confidence." They went at station night when the corridors were dim and the guards were at half rotation. Juno triggered the cascade at exactly 300, and the station shuddered and groaned like a wounded animal, and alarms began screaming in 6 different languages, and the lights in the docking ring went red and then went dark. 9 minutes. Terk moved first. He went down the corridor like a freight train in body armor, and the first Valkyrie guard he met was so shocked to see a human charging at him that he hesitated for half a second, which was half a second too long because Terk hit him with a force that sent him through a partition wall. The Valkyrie were stronger than humans, faster too, and their armor was better and their weapons were better, and by every objective measure they should have won every fight. But the Valkyrie had been conquering lesser species for 10,000 years, and in all that time they had never met a species that simply refused to stop. They would hurt a human, and the human would keep coming. They would knock a human down, and the human would get back up. And there was something deeply unsettling about an enemy who did not seem to understand that they were supposed to lose. Terk held that corridor against 4 Valkyrie soldiers, and he took hits that would have dropped any sane creature. But he did not drop because somewhere in the back of his mind, there was a photograph of a little girl with a gap-toothed smile, and he was not going to die in a hallway when there were children who needed saving. Kale and Doc reached the holding area and found the 12 Valith huddled together in the dark, their skin flickering with distress, their eyes wide with terror. Doc knelt beside the first child and placed his device against the collar and pressed the trigger, and there was a sharp hiss and a spark, and the collar fell away, and the child gasped like someone coming up from underwater. One by one he freed them, his hands steady even though his heart was pounding, speaking softly to each one in a voice that said, "You are safe," even though they could not understand his words because kindness does not need translation. Kale reached Syrah last. She was pressed against the wall with her arms wrapped around herself, and her luminous eyes were locked on him, and he could see that she was reading him, feeling everything inside him, his fear and his determination and his fury, and beneath all of it, the thing that had brought him here, which was something so simple and so human that it did not have a name in any alien language. He knelt in front of her and said, "I am going to take this off, and it is going to hurt for a second, and then you are going to be free. Do you understand?" She did not speak his language, but she felt his meaning, and she nodded. He placed the device against her collar and triggered it, and the metal fell away, and Syrah made a sound that was half scream and half sob, as the full force of her empathic ability came flooding back. Every emotion on the station hitting her like a wave, fear and anger and greed and cruelty and pain. And then she felt Kale. She felt the inside of him, the grief and the guilt and the exhaustion and the scar tissue on his soul from years of fighting and losing and fighting again. And beneath all of it, like bedrock under a river, she felt something that stopped her cold. It was refusal, pure and absolute and unbreakable. A wall inside him that said, "Not this, not ever, not while I am breathing." She whispered, and her voice was shaking with wonder, "You are so loud." Kale picked her up and said, "We have to go now." They ran, 12 children and 2 humans, through corridors full of smoke and screaming alarms. And Terk was waiting for them, bloody and bruised and grinning, with his back against a wall and his weapon in his hand. And they ran together toward the docking bay where Rena had the Defiance roaring and ready. They made it with 40 seconds to spare. Rena punched the engines, and the Defiance tore out of Vethris station like a bullet from a gun, and behind them, the station's security systems were already locking down, and Valkyrie fighters were already scrambling to pursue. But they were gone, burning hard into the black, with 12 freed children in the cargo hold and half the hull scorched, and every alarm on the ship screaming. In his throne room on Vethris station, Archon Driven Salkith stood very still for a very long time. A human had stolen from him. A human had entered his domain and taken his property and killed his soldiers and escaped. He was not angry. Anger was beneath him. He was something far more dangerous than angry. He was insulted. He opened a channel to the Valkyrie High Command, and his voice was cold and flat and final. "A human has challenged the Dominion. I request authorization to respond with full force." The authorization came in minutes. And somewhere in the dark between stars, a small ship called the Defiance carried 12 sleeping children toward a future that none of them could see, a future built on the back of one man's refusal to look away, a future that would shake the galaxy to its foundations. But they did not know that yet. Right now, they were just running. Meridian was the kind of world that made you believe the universe could be gentle if it wanted to. It was a farming colony on the edge of Terran space, green and golden and quiet, with wide fields of grain that stretched to the horizon, and a sky so blue it looked like it had been painted by Sohm. Eon, who remembered what peace felt like, of 40,000 people lived there, and most of them had come to get away from something, and had found instead a place worth staying for. Kale brought the Defiance down in a field outside the main settlement, and the landing gear sank into soft earth. And for the first time in 4 days, he sat down in the pilot's seat and closed his eyes and breathed. They had made it. The 12 Valeth children were in the cargo hold, wrapped in blankets that Doc had found in the emergency supplies. Most of them were sleeping. Some were still too afraid to sleep and sat with their luminous eyes open and their hands gripping each other. And Sira sat among them like a small, quiet guardian, watching everything and feeling everything and trying to make sense of a universe that had suddenly changed shape around her. Kale went to the UEF garrison that was stationed on the edge of the settlement, a small base with 200 soldiers whose primary job was to watch for pirate activity and file reports that nobody read, and he asked to see the commanding officer. Colonel Liz Fontaine was a woman in her 50s with gray hair cut short, and the kind of face that had been weathered by years of doing the right thing in places where the right thing was never easy. She had served on 6 colony worlds and had buried friends on 4 of them, and she had the steady eyes of someone who had made peace with the fact that the universe was not fair but had decided to show up anyway. Kale told her everything, the auction and the collars and the rescue, and the fact that the Valkyrie were almost certainly coming. And when he finished, she sat behind her desk for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "You have brought a war to my doorstep." And Kale said, "I know and I am sorry." And she said, "Are they really children?" And he said, "Yes." And she closed her eyes and opened them and said, "Show me." He took her to the Defiance and she walked into the cargo hold and she saw them, 12 small luminous beings huddled together in borrowed blankets. And one of them looked up at her and flinched, and Fontaine stopped moving immediately because she understood what that flinch meant. It meant that every adult this child had ever known had been a source of pain. She knelt down slowly, the way you kneel near a frightened animal, and she said, "No one is going to hurt you here." And Sira, who was watching from across the hold, felt the colonel's emotions, and what she felt made her breath catch. Because Fontaine meant it, not the way people mean polite things they say to be kind, but the way a wall means to stand between the wind and everything behind it. It was structural and absolute, and it went all the way down to the foundation of who this woman was. Fontaine stood up and looked at Kale and said, "I will contact Earth Command." The response came back in 6 hours, and it was exactly what Kale had feared. The message was official and cold, and it said that Terran policy was to avoid armed conflict with the Valkyrie Dominion, and that the garrison was advised to comply with all Valkyrie demands, and that Earth Command would not be dispatching reinforcements, and that any officer who disobeyed this directive would be held personally responsible for the consequences. Fontaine read the message twice. Then she looked out her office window and saw something that the bureaucrats on Earth could not see. She saw a Valeth child sitting in the grass outside the garrison building, sitting in grass for what was probably the first time in her life. And the child was touching the blades with her fingers one by one, and her skin was glowing softly, and her face held an expression of such pure, bewildered wonder that Fontaine had to look away for a moment because her eyes were burning. She deleted the message. Meanwhile, something was happening in the settlement that nobody had planned. The people of Meridian had learned about the children. Word traveled fast in a small colony, and they had responded in the way that humans respond to suffering children, which is to say they responded with everything they had. An old farmer named Marta, who had raised 4 children of her own and buried one, walked up to the Defiance with a basket of fresh bread and a blanket she had knitted herself, and she sat down next to a Valeth child who was too afraid to eat, and she did not push or pressure or demand. She simply sat there and ate a piece of bread herself and hummed a song and waited. After 20 minutes, the child reached for a piece of bread, and Marta smiled and said, "There you go, sweetheart." And the child did not understand the words, but understood the warmth and took a bite and then another. Sira watched this from across the room and felt the old woman's emotions, and they were so simple and so powerful that they overwhelmed her. It was love, Not the complicated love between partners or the fierce love between parents and their own children, but something wider and deeper. It was the love that says, "You are small and you are hurting and I am here and that is enough." Sira had spent her entire life reading the emotions of other species. She had felt Valkyrie coldness and Korvathi resignation, and the numb obedience of a dozen enslaved worlds. But she had never felt anything like this. This irrational, generous, furious tenderness that humans seemed to carry inside them like a fire they could not put out. She started to cry, and she did not know what. 3 days passed, and they were the most peaceful days those children had ever known, and then the sky broke open. Salkith's hunter fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel above Meridian, 3 warships, each one larger than the entire settlement, and they blotted out the stars like a hand closing over a candle. The lead ship broadcast an ultimatum, and Salkith's voice filled every speaker on the planet. Cold and measured, and perfectly polite in the way that a predator is polite when it knows its prey cannot run. He said, "You are harboring stolen property of the Valkyrie Dominion. You will return the 12 Valith subjects and the human who took them within 6 standard hours. Failure to comply will result in the disciplining of this colony. This is not a negotiation." Fontaine stood in her command center and listened, and her officers looked at her and waited, and the weight of 40,000 lives pressed down on her shoulders like gravity. She thought about the message from Earth Command. She thought about the child in the grass, touching each blade like it was a miracle. She opened a broadcast channel, not a private military channel but an open channel, every frequency, every relay, so that anyone in range could hear. And she said, "This is Colonel Lise Fontaine of the United Earth Fleet Garrison on Meridian. There are children on this world under our protection. We will not surrender them. If you want them, you will have to come down here and take them from us." She closed the channel and the room was silent, and she could feel her officers staring at her, and she could feel the fear in the room, and she could feel her own heart hammering against her ribs. But she could also feel something else, something that started small and grew. It started with her second-in-command who straightened his back and checked his weapon, and then the comms officer who turned back to her console with a new hardness in her jaw, and then, one by one, every person in that room chose. Not because they were brave, but because they were human, and because there were children outside who had just learned what grass felt like. The broadcast went out into the dark, and the dark listened. On a dozen colony worlds and space stations and ships, people heard Colonel Fontaine's voice, and something stirred inside them, something old and stubborn and unbreakable. And comm channels began lighting up with messages, and civilian ships began changing course, and a word began to spread through human space like fire through dry grass. The word was Meridian. And somewhere above that small green world, Archon Salkith listened to the broadcast and felt something flicker at the edge of his ancient composure. Not concern exactly. The Valkyrie did not feel concern for lesser species, but something like curiosity. Because in 10,000 years of conquest, no species had ever said no quite like that. He gave the order and the bombardment began, not on the settlement, but on the outer farms, pillars of fire falling from the sky like the anger of a god. And the ground shook and the horizon turned orange. And the war started. And it started not with armies or fleets or grand strategies. It started with a woman who deleted a message and chose the children instead. The Valkyrie had been fighting wars for 10,000 years, and they had never lost one, and the reason they had never lost one was simple. They were better at it than everyone else. Their soldiers were faster and stronger, and their armor was superior, and their weapons were more advanced, and their tactics had been refined over centuries of conquest, until every battle was a machine, and every victory was inevitable. So when Archon Salkith sent his ground forces down to Meridian, he expected what he always expected: a brief, ugly resistance followed by surrender, followed by punishment, followed by silence. He did not get what he expected. The first Valkyrie drop teams landed in the agricultural district east of the main settlement. 200 elite soldiers in heavy assault gear, and they moved through the burning fields in perfect formation, expecting to find a broken garrison waiting to negotiate terms. Instead, they found Terk Dunn standing on a bridge over an irrigation canal with a mounted gun he had pulled from the Defiance and welded to a piece of farm equipment. He opened fire and he did not stop. The Valkyrie took cover and returned fire, and their weapons punched holes through the barricades Terk had built from grain containers and tractor parts. And a plasma round caught him in the left shoulder and burned through his armor, and he could smell his own flesh cooking. And he did not stop. He had placed explosive charges under the bridge, homemade devices built from fertilizer and engine parts, because Meridian was a farm world and farm worlds had fertilizer and engine parts in abundance. And when the Valkyrie pushed forward, he waited until they were on the bridge, and then he blew it. The bridge collapsed into the canal and took 30 Valkyrie soldiers with it, and Terk was already moving, falling back to the next position, bleeding and singing an old Earth song under his breath, because the singing kept him focused and kept him human and kept him from thinking about how much everything hurt. That was the first lesson the Valkyrie learned on Meridian. Humans do not stop when they are injured. They do not stop when they are outnumbered. They do not stop when every rational calculation says they should surrender, because humans are not rational about certain things, and the safety of children is one of those things. The second lesson came in the settlement itself. Colonel Fontaine had turned every building into a fortress, not with military technology but with human ingenuity. Doors were barricaded with furniture and farming tools. Windows were turned into firing positions. Tunnels were dug between basements using shovels and bare hands. And the people of Meridian fought alongside the soldiers because on Meridian every farmer owned a rifle, and every farmer knew how to use it. The Valkyrie ground commander was a veteran of 40 campaigns, and he reported back to Salkith with something that sounded almost like confusion in his voice. He said, "They are using their own infrastructure against us. They are collapsing buildings on our advanced teams. They are flooding streets with irrigation water to disable our ground vehicles. They set fire to their own grain stores to create smoke cover for their movements." Salkith said, "They are burning their own food supply." The commander said yes. Salkith did not understand this. The Valkyrie fought to preserve and to conquer. They would never destroy their own resources. It was wasteful and irrational, and it violated every principle of efficient warfare. But humans were not fighting to preserve anything except each other. A farmer named Gregor, who had spent 20 years growing wheat on Meridian, stood in his field with a torch in his hand and watched his entire life's work catch fire, the flames climbing through the golden stalks like living things. And a young soldier next to him said, "Sir, your whole crop." And Gregor said, "We can replant grain. We cannot replant kids." And he said it with such matter-of-fact certainty that the soldier just nodded and helped him spread the fire wider. The smoke rolled across the battlefield like a gray ocean, and behind it, the humans moved and fought and disappeared and moved again. And the Valkyrie, who were used to enemies who stood in formation and fought with honor and surrendered when beaten, found themselves fighting ghosts. Rena flew the Defiance in atmosphere, which was something the ship was absolutely not designed to do. It was a freighter, not a fighter, and it handled in atmosphere like a brick with ambitions. But Rena did not care about what the ship was designed to do because she had never in her life done what she was supposed to do, and she was not about to start now. She came in low over the Valkyrie landing zone and strafed their dropships with the Defiance's cargo-mounted guns, weapons that were meant for scaring off pirates not fighting a galactic empire. And she hit 2 dropships and disabled a third, and then she pulled up so hard that the hull groaned, and Juno said that maneuver exceeded the structural tolerance of this vessel by 47%. And Rena said, "But did we die?" And Juno said, "Not yet." And Rena said, "Then we are fine." On the ground, the fighting was brutal and close and desperate, and there were moments of horror and moments of something that could only be called grace. Doc set up his field hospital in the basement of the settlement school. The children had been evacuated to underground shelters, so the building was empty, and he treated everyone who came through the door regardless of what species they were. A Valkyrie soldier was brought in unconscious, captured during a failed assault on the western barricade, and he woke up on a cot with his wounds bandaged and his armor removed and Doc standing over him with a cup of water. The soldier looked around in confusion and said, "Why am I alive?" Doc said, "Because you are wounded and I am a doctor, and that is how this works." The soldier said, "I am your enemy." Doc said, "You are a patient, that is all you are in here." The soldier stared at him for a long time, and something shifted behind his eyes, something that looked like the first crack in a wall that had been standing for a very long time. Because the Valkyrie do not show mercy to prisoners, and they do not heal their enemies, and the concept of treating a wounded foe with kindness was so alien to him that he could not fit it into his understanding of the universe. Meanwhile, Sira had become the most important person on Meridian. Her empathic abilities, fully awakened now that the collar was gone, allowed her to sense emotional signatures across enormous distances. She could feel the Valkyrie troops moving through the settlement by the cold, sharp pattern of their emotions. She could feel their fear and their confusion and their growing unease. And she reported their positions to Fontaine in real time, turning the defenders' greatest weakness into their greatest strength. But what Sira felt most of all, what overwhelmed her every waking moment, was the sheer volume of human emotion around her. She had spent her life among the Valkyrie whose emotions were controlled and cold and calculated, but humans were a symphony and a storm and a bonfire all at once. They felt everything with such intensity that it was almost painful to be near them. Their fear was sharp and bright, and their anger was hot, and their love was so fierce that it burned. She found Kale during a lull in the fighting. He was sitting against a wall with blood on his hands and exhaustion carved into every line of his face. And she sat down next to him and said, "My people have been reading emotions for 1,000 years. I have never felt anything like what you are." Kale looked at her with red-rimmed eyes and said, "We are not special. We just cannot look away." And Sira thought about that, about a species that could not look away, that saw suffering and felt it as their own, that burned their own fields and healed their enemies and fought against impossible odds, not because they thought they could win, but because they could not bear to do nothing. She thought, this is the most dangerous thing in the universe. Not their weapons, not their ships, not their technology. Their refusal to look away. The battle raged for 3 days, and on the third day, the sky filled with new lights, ships dropping out of faster-than-light travel. And at first Fontaine thought it was Valkyrie reinforcements and her stomach dropped. But the transponder codes were human. They came from everywhere. A rogue UEF battle group led by a carrier called the Prometheus, whose captain had heard Fontaine's broadcast and had simply turned off her comm link to Earth Command and changed course. And behind the Prometheus came civilian freighters and mining ships and passenger liners. Unarmed, unarmored ships that had no business being in a war zone, piloted by people who had heard a woman's voice saying, "There are children here," and had decided that was enough reason to cross the stars. It was not strategic and it was not coordinated and it was not rational. It was human. Salkith stood on the bridge of his dreadnought and watched the human ships arrive, and for the first time in his very long life, he felt something he did not have a word for. It was not fear. The Valkyrie did not fear lesser species. But it was something close. He had expected a species, and what he had found was a force of nature. Something that did not obey the rules he understood, something that grew stronger the harder you pushed it. And for one brief moment, Archon Driven Salkith wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. Then he pushed that thought aside and opened a channel to the Valkyrie High Command. The situation has escalated. I am requesting authorization for the gravity lance. The gravity lance was the Valkyrie's final word, a weapon that could crack a planet's crust and turn a living world into a tomb of fire and stone. It had been used 3 times in the history of the Dominion, and each time it had ended not just a battle but a species. The authorization came through. And above Meridian, the dreadnought's hull began to glow as the weapon charged, a low, terrible hum that vibrated through the void. And on the surface, the humans looked up and saw their death coming down from the stars like the closing of a fist. And they did not run. The gravity lance took 11 minutes to charge, and during those 11 minutes, the universe held its breath. Kale stood in the command center next to Fontaine, and they both watched the tactical display. The Valkyrie dreadnought hanging above them like a sword, its hull radiating energy as the weapon built toward critical. And on the ground 40,000 humans and 12 Valith children who had finally learned what it felt like to be free. Fontaine said, "How long?" Juno's voice came through the speakers, calm as always, but with something underneath that might have been grief if an AI could grieve. 11 minutes to full charge. The weapon will penetrate the planetary crust within seconds of firing. There will be no survivable zone. Fontaine began issuing evacuation orders, but they both knew the math. There were not enough ships on the ground to evacuate 40,000 people in 11 minutes. There was not enough time. There was never enough time. Syrah found Kale in the corridor outside, and she grabbed his arm and her eyes were wide and wild, and she said, "I can feel him." "Who?" "Salkith, I can feel him from here. His emotions are strong enough to read from orbit." Kale looked at her and said, "What is he feeling?" And Syrah said something that changed everything. She said, "He is not angry, he is afraid. They are all afraid." Kale stopped moving. He stood in that corridor with alarms blaring and the ground trembling beneath him, and he understood. He understood all of it, in a single flash of clarity that cut through the chaos like a blade through smoke. The Valkyrie were not destroying Meridian because humans were a military threat. Humanity's fleet was tiny compared to the Dominion. Their technology was inferior. Their empire was barely a century old. The Valkyrie were destroying Meridian because of what had happened here. Because a species had looked at someone else's suffering and had burned their own fields and disobeyed their own government and crossed the stars to protect children that were not their own. And if the other subjugated species of the Dominion saw that, if the Valith and the Korvathi and the Seth and the dozens of other enslaved peoples saw that it was possible to say no, then the entire foundation of the Valkyrie Empire would crack. The Dominion was not built on military power. Not really. It was built on a belief. The belief that resistance was pointless, that the strong ruled and the weak served, and that this was the natural order of things and could not be changed. Humanity had just proved that belief was a lie. And lies once exposed cannot be unexposed. That was what Salkith was afraid of, not the humans, but what the humans represented, the idea that someone somewhere could look at 10,000 years of empire and say, "No, this is wrong, and I will fight you even though I cannot win." Kale turned and ran, not away from the danger but toward the docking bay. And his crew saw him coming and knew that look, and Rena was already firing up the engines before he reached the cockpit. He said, "Open a broadcast channel, every frequency, every relay. I want every species in this sector to hear what I am about to say." Rena said, "Kale, what are you doing?" He said, "The only thing that matters." And then he flew the Defiant straight up, burning through the atmosphere like a comet in reverse, straight towards Salkith's dreadnought. And he was broadcasting on every channel, and his voice went out into the dark, and it reached ships and stations and worlds across the sector. He said, "This is Commander Kale Marin of the human ship Defiance. I am speaking to every species in the Valkyrie Dominion, every slave world, every conquered people, Every being who has been told that resistance is impossible and that obedience is the only option. The dreadnought's weapons locked onto him, and he kept flying. The Valkyrie are about to destroy a world of 40,000 people to punish us for protecting 12 children. They want you to watch, and they want you to be afraid. Warning alarms filled the cockpit, and Rena was swearing, and Juno was calculating evasion routes, and Kale kept talking. I want you to watch too, but I want you to ask yourself one question. If a species this small and this new and this outmatched can stand up and say no, what is stopping you? The broadcast hit every relay in the sector. It bounced from station to station and ship to ship. And on 100 worlds, beings of a dozen different species heard a human voice, raw and tired and unafraid, asking them a question they had never been asked before. What is stopping you? On the bridge of his dreadnought, Salkith heard the broadcast and his composure cracked. Just for a moment, just enough for his officers to see, and he gave the order to fire. The gravity lance discharged, a beam of compressed gravitational force so powerful that space itself bent around it, aimed directly at Meridian, at the fields and the settlement, and the children who had just learned what grass felt like. And the Prometheus moved into its path. Captain Ajora Obi of the UEF carrier Prometheus had heard the broadcast too. She had heard Kale's voice and Fontaine's voice before that, and she had been a captain for 12 years, and she had always believed that the purpose of a warship was to stand between danger and the people it protected. She gave the order, and the Prometheus, all 800 meters of her, positioned itself directly between the gravity lance and the planet. The beam hit the carrier amidships, and the ship screamed, metal tearing and reactors overloading and bulkheads collapsing. And Captain Obi ordered every reactor vented, every power cell discharged, flooding the beam with energy to diffuse its force before it reached the surface. The Prometheus broke apart, torn nearly in half by forces that should have shattered a world, and her crew died, not all of them but many of them. Hundreds of people who had woken up that morning and eaten breakfast and checked their messages and lived the small, ordinary moments of ordinary lives before choosing to stand in the way of something terrible. Captain Obi's final transmission was not a speech, and it was not a prayer. It was simple and direct and aimed at one person. She said, "Fontaine, tell those kids they are safe." And then the Prometheus was gone. But Meridian was still there. The beam, diffused by the carrier's sacrifice, struck the upper atmosphere and dissipated in a cascade of light that turned the sky white for 30 seconds, and when the light faded, the planet was whole, and the settlement was standing, and 40,000 humans were alive, and 12 Valeth children were safe. The silence that followed lasted a long time. Salkith looked at the debris field that had been the Prometheus, at the pieces of a human ship scattered across orbit, and he understood something that he did not want to understand. He understood that he could not win this. Not because the humans were stronger, they were not because they were more advanced, they were not, but because they were willing to die in ways that the Valkyrie could not match, and for reasons the Valkyrie could not comprehend. A warship had placed itself between a weapon and a world full of strangers, and had chosen to die rather than let those strangers be harmed. What do you do with an enemy like that? How do you conquer a species that considers self-sacrifice for strangers to be a reasonable tactical option? Salkith ordered his fleet to withdraw as his ships turned away from Meridian. He knew, in the cold, rational core of his ancient mind, that the Valkyrie Dominion had just lost something far more important than a battle. It had lost the illusion of inevitability. Kale's broadcast spread, not like news but like fire, like a seed carried on a wind that would not stop blowing. The Valeth heard it first, the quiet, broken empaths who had served the Valkyrie for centuries, and something woke up inside them. Something that the collars and the pain and the centuries of submission had buried but not killed. And on a dozen worlds, They began to whisper to each other in the old language that the Valkyrie had forbidden, and the whisper said, the humans said no. Then the Korvathi miners heard it, massive stone-skinned beings who had been digging ore for the Valkyrie since before humanity existed, and they put down their tools and looked at each other, and one of them said, "If the small ones can fight, then so can we." Then the Seth navigators heard it, the ones who guided Valkyrie ships through deep space, and they began to make mistakes, small ones at first, miscalculations in navigation that sent ships to the wrong systems, delays that cost days and then weeks. And when the Valkyrie demanded to know why, the Seth said, "We are sorry, we are trying our best," and their faces showed nothing but their hearts were burning. Within one galactic standard year, 14 Valkyrie client species began open rebellion. Within 3 years, the Dominion was fighting on more fronts than it had armies to cover. Within 5 years, the cracks had become chasms. Within a decade, the Valkyrie Empire, the oldest power in the known galaxy, 10,000 years of conquest and control and absolute dominion, collapsed. Not because of a fleet, not because of a weapon, not because of a war. Because of an idea. The idea was simple and it was human, and it was this: you do not have to accept this. That was all just 5 words, and they brought down an empire. Years later, after the treaties were signed and the slave worlds were freed, and the galaxy began the slow, painful work of rebuilding, Syrah stood before the new Galactic Council as the ambassador of the liberated Valith people. She was grown now, tall and luminous, and carrying herself with a quiet dignity that made people stop and listen when she entered a room. And the council had asked her to describe humanity for the official record, to explain to the gathered species what humans were and why they mattered. She stood at the podium and looked out at the representatives of 100 worlds, and she was quiet for a long time. She thought about a cargo hold on a small ship, and a man kneeling in front of her with steady hands and kind eyes. She thought about an old woman named Marta sitting beside a frightened child and humming a song and waiting. She thought about a colonel who deleted a message and chose the children. She thought about a farmer who burned his own field and said, "We can replant grain." She thought about a doctor who healed his enemies, because that was how things worked in his world. She thought about a ship called the Prometheus, and a captain whose last words were, "Tell those kids they are safe." She thought about all of it, every moment, every choice, every act of stubborn, irrational, magnificent humanity. And she felt her eyes burning the way they had burned in that cargo hold so many years ago, when she first felt the impossible warmth of human compassion. And she said, "They are not the strongest species, they are not the smartest, they are not the most advanced, but they are the ones who look at someone else's suffering and make it their own." The Valkyrie built an empire on the belief that no one would fight for a stranger. Humanity did not just prove them wrong. They made the entire galaxy ask why we ever believed it in the first place. She paused and the chamber was silent. That is what humans are, and that is why the Dominion fell. She stepped away from the podium and the chamber erupted, but she did not hear it. She was thinking about Kale, about a man in a slave market who had looked at a frightened girl, and then looked at her captors, and had decided without speeches or glory or any expectation of survival, that this was where his line was drawn. One man, one moment, one refusal to look away. And an empire fell. Not with a bang and not with a whimper, but with a hand reaching out to a stranger and saying, "You are not alone."